Welcome to Week 3, History of Japan. This week we're going to look at everything from the Heian period from 794, and then we're going to build up to feudalism and the Tokugawa shogunate. The Heian period, which lasted from 794 to 1180 CE, that is Christian era, or otherwise known as AD, takes place with its center, its capital, at Heian, which is today the current city of Kyoto, and it begins in 794 CE. Heian was a large city. It literally means, by the way, peace, and it was planned in a grid-like fashion, so where its streets are at right angles to one another, intersecting. And it was 3 miles by 3.5 miles in size. Of course, initially only about half of it was developed. One of the significant things that happens during the Heian period is that those very close relations between Japan and China begin to dwindle a little bit. And in fact, the Heian period will become one of the classical periods of Japanese civilization, where the Japanese will begin to develop their own kind of unique political system, which, although still based on a lot of the Chinese political system, is nonetheless uniquely Japanese. And the same thing kind of happens with much of the culture and literature, as the Heian period really marks or witnesses a flowering of Japanese culture, one of the classical periods of Japanese culture. One of the things that happens politically is the Fujiwara family becomes very influential, so influential, in fact, that they gain the honor or the privilege of marrying their Fujiwara daughters to imperial family princes. So they're literally marrying into the imperial family. And at one point in time, first accidentally, and then it becomes very much purposeful. In the mid-1800s, the child emperor came, in the mid-800s, a child emperor came to the throne. And of course, child emperors cannot rule on their own behalf, but they need adult regents to rule on behalf of them. So the Fujiwara family provided an adult regent for this child emperor. And then they thought, the system worked so well that in fact what they would end up doing is the Fujiwara family began to act as regents for not only child emperors, but adult emperors as well. And the system which really develops in Japanese politics is called second politics. That is, whereby a regent was really in power for about the next 300 years or so. Now, the emperor was kept busy doing kind of ceremonial work. So generally the emperors got up at about 3 a.m. each morning to perform the Shinto ceremonies and the ceremonies, that surrounded those of Confucianism. So what really develops in Japan is this kind of bifurcated system, this divided system, where the focus of authority remained with the emperor, the imperial family, which of course held the sacred symbols of the sword, the mirror, and the jewel, based, as we saw last time, upon those very ancient myths of the founding of Japan. But while the focus of authority remained with the emperor, the focus of power from this point in time was really almost someplace else, always someplace else. It was at first in the regent who acted, the Fujiwara regent who acted on behalf of the emperor, and as we will see in this lecture, it will shift to a retired emperor, and then to a shogun, and even to a shogunal regent. Now, partly this seems to have been a cultural thing. It seemed to be something comfortable for the Japanese, and this multi-layered somewhat system is going to be very important to an understanding of Japanese politics from this point henceforth on. Now, the last time we had spoken about how agricultural societies generally fall into a almost endemic cycle which can lead to manorialism and feudalism. And we had explained that, agricultural societies obviously are dependent upon agriculture, and as the population increases, there's not necessarily a concomitant increase in the amount of land. Sometimes the societies can try to correct that by increasing the amount of land under cultivation, which of course could be through such things as reclaiming marshland, or maybe trying to terrace off hillsides in order to make them arable for cultivation of agricultural products. But oftentimes that's not enough. And as the peasant population increases, there's not a corresponding increase in the land owned by the peasants. And so the peasants find it increasingly difficult to get along. Their quality of life declines, and sometimes it inevitably leads to a system where the peasants can no longer afford to hold on to their land because they're paying taxes. And those taxes, which are sometimes a percentage of the agricultural produce that they produced, are becoming increasingly difficult for them to pay. So oftentimes they'll, through a process of commendation, they'll commend their land, they'll give up their land, either voluntarily or involuntarily if they become indebted to wealthy landowners in the area. And so begins a whole process that leads us down a path, as we said the last time, of manorialism, which is an economic system where largely you have large landowners that generally are tax exempt, and underneath them a whole bunch of peasants who are tied to a manor, to the land of the wealthy, and don't own their own land anymore. Now, we said that the Japanese copied a system that the Chinese had during the Tang Dynasty, which was called an equal land system, whereby they actually did censuses. They conducted censuses every so number of years. They found out where the population had increased, and they redistributed land to the peasants accordingly, so that each male peasant and female peasant as well of an adult age would have a certain amount of land to support themselves. They had done that in Japan. This is a very cumbersome system, an equal land system that requires censuses, that requires constant redistribution of land. And like many cumbersome systems, it had begun to break down by the 800s or so in Japan during the Heian period. And so what grew up in Japan were a series of privately held lands or estates, which are referred to as shoen. And these were owned by Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, and wealthy landowners. They owned these shoen. They owned these privately held lands that were largely tax exempt. And you may ask the reason why were they tax exempt? Well, in the case of Buddhist temples or Shinto shrines, that enabled them to build up an endowment to pay for those religious buildings and ceremonies and the like that were deemed necessary for society. And in the case of wealthy landowners, they usually were the government officials. And government officials back in those days were not paid a salary. In lieu of a salary, they were given land, and that was tax-exempt land. So what happens is the peasants simply cannot afford to pay all of their taxes. So they begin to commend their land, to give over their land, either voluntarily or involuntarily, to these shoen. And these shoen are part of a greater kind of hierarchy, a kind of pyramid in Japanese society in terms of the economy. And at the top of that were these so-called protectors, these folks like these Buddhist temples and private lords of estates who could offer honkei. They were literally protectors who could offer tax-exempt status to people who came to them. But unlike the manors of, say, medieval Europe during feudal Europe, the shoen were a bit more complicated. And they actually functioned kind of like, and this is stretching the analogy a bit, but nonetheless it will serve us, if we kind of related them as to like owning shares in a company. You know, you might own a couple of shares in P&G, and you might think of that as, maybe maybe you own the doorknob of an office door in P&G, right? It might be such a small share that you have that you might, relate it to something like that. Well, in the case of the Shoen, they were estates, they were producing rice, so you could literally have a share in the rice production, or a share in the cloth production, or literally a share in the roof tiles of one of the buildings. So the income from that Shoen could be, in fact, distributed to the so-called share owners of the Shoen. Kind of a difficult process, but nonetheless not one that is too difficult for us to understand. What essentially we see here is the beginnings of a manorial system, of an economic system, where more and more land is falling into the hands of fewer and fewer larger wealthy landowners, and falling out of the hands of the peasants, and where this system will eventually lead to full-fledged feudalism, which is the military and political equivalent of manorialism. And so a lot of people were playing this game of the Shoen by about the year 1100 or so. In fact, we can give you a statistic that by 1050 AD, about 40% of the arable land of Japan was Shoen. So essentially, the central government was becoming decentralized. The government was becoming privatized. Government services were being supplied more locally. Everything was becoming more fragmented. Everything was becoming more local. And a military class was even beginning to develop among the Shoen. It's interesting to point out that women could own property during this period and hold portfolios, so to speak, in the Shoen themselves. Of course, Japan, like many other places, still has an emperor at its height during this point in time, at the top of the hierarchy. And underneath the emperor were a number of different ranks, 12 ranks actually. And you wore different color clothing that symbolized the different rank that you were at. You also had a different title based upon the different rank that you were at. And of course, this would only apply to those imperial courtly officials and those of the upper classes. Let's talk a little bit about some of those upper classes and about the cultural institutions, and a lot about women in the Heian period, because women really did hold quite a bit of power during the Heian period. Particularly, obviously, we're talking about the upper class women, upper class men. So let's talk about Heian marriage. Well, number one, with the upper class, all marriages were arranged marriages. That is, marriages were arranged for a son or a daughter, and sometimes they were arranged very early on. They would happen years later. And you might ask, well, why were they arranged marriages? Well, marriage back in that time wasn't really, among the upper classes, about love. It wasn't about romance. It was a political and economic convention. It was a political and economic arrangement, and those two things went hand in hand. You wanted to make certain that you married into a family that could be your political ally, or that would help you economically, or certainly be of the same upper class that you were economically. So that was the number one thing. Arranged marriages, and marriage at that time, largely, this is true, largely worldwide at the time, was an economic and political institution. It was not an institution of love and religion, a religious state, or anything else. Number two, that didn't mean that love and romance didn't happen. Love and romance have been around, and sex for a long time in world history. And so number two is that love and romantic relationships, especially among the upper class, often occurred outside of marriage. Okay, so women could have lovers, men could have lovers as well. Number three, in the case of men, you could have more than one wife. Secondary wives were certainly socially acceptable. Again, we're talking about the upper class. And you could have a child by a woman who was not your wife, but your consort. and the paternity of that child could be recognized without marrying the mother. Of course, you were expected to provide economic and political support for that son or daughter. But women, of course, could own property on their own, as we've said at this time. So upper-class women didn't necessarily need to rely upon a man economically. Many women were economically independent. They were self-sufficient. And those women who were wealthy enough obviously had servants to help them, ladies in waiting, who literally, were the companions of the women they served and would, even sleep, with their clothes on, sleep with their the woman that they served. They would help them get dressed in the morning. They would, help them, write poetry and do all that other stuff. The fashion of the time, both among men and women, were to use makeup to produce this kind of pasty white face. And you might say, well, why? And in our society, we generally regard, dark skin and olive skin as something that we all want to see, we all want to look like. And why would this pasty white face be so desirable? Well, if you think of it, the peasants were out in the sun working, planting crops and harvesting crops, and they usually were the ones who had a darker complexion. And so the upper classes, they didn't want to look like darker peasants. They wanted to look like the Tang Dynasty had in China, this very popular pasty white skin. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that some of the things, the leads and so forth that they were using in their makeup would not be good for them in terms of their health, but that was something that they did not know at the time. Men and women were proud if they had a few extra pounds or more than a few extra pounds in the upper class. That showed that they were wealthy enough to be able to eat and eat well, and not just eat to sustain yourself, but to enjoy what you're doing. And obviously the peasants would have been rather on the thin side, so again, one didn't want to look like a peasant. They wore a lot of perfume at this time period. They liked incense. They certainly liked baths. The Japanese baths were very popular, and they bathed very often. Of course, the hot, humid climate of Japan made that really a necessity, although one could argue that in Europe of the time, sometimes you might have gotten a bath once in your entire lifetime. Europe was not known for its love of baths or its cleanliness at the time, where that certainly was something that was very well admired and desired was the sense of meticulous cleanliness in Japan. Women would spend, upper-class women, much of their time behind a screen of state, literally a screen with a cloth hanging over it. And any decent upper-class woman would spend most of her life there in her room with her ladies-in-waiting, writing poems and practicing calligraphy and passing messages back and forth. So again, women were very literate at the time. They were allowed to receive, male suitors, and the male suitors could, they could pass little messages and poems back between one another through the curtain. And if a woman invited a male suitor to come around the curtain, it was pretty much a public acknowledgement of the acceptance of a love affair between the two. So women really did have not only ownership of property, at least upper class again women, but also love affairs. They were literate, and they certainly were also leaders in literature of the time period. And the literature of the time period really did focus a lot on these kind of tales, T-A-L-E-S, which the Japanese called monogatari. And perhaps the most well-known of those was the tale of Genji, which was written by a woman, Murasaki Shikibu. Murasaki Shikibu was of a low-ranking Fujiwara family. This was not her real name, but her name she took on in terms of literature. She was an attendant of one of the consorts of the emperor, and she wrote this tale, it's not true, of a prince named Genji who had many love affairs. The one thing about Genji that we can say, it was a very good psychological novel, really exploring the depth of people's emotions. And in fact, one could say that it was one of the first novels, one of the first works in the world to do this. It's also a very good example of Mono no Aware, which is hard to translate, but which we might translate as sort of an awareness of the sadness of things, an awareness of the transience, of the impermanence of life. We began this class by defining, history as a study of change over place and time, and the Japanese understood very much of the impermanence and transience of life, of how life changed, and particularly how beauty could be existing one moment and a moment later it could be gone. And so for instance, an example of this is the Japanese love of the cherry blossom tree, right? The cherry tree, which in spring produces these beautiful cherry blossoms, but they're so transient. They only last for a very short time, for a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, and then they fall from the tree. And they're beautiful, but then they leave. So it's this Mono no Aware. Another very well-known book of the time period was also by a woman, and it was the pillow book of Sei Shonagon. And Sei Shonagon was a woman who was of the upper class, and it was of a genre of literature which was kind of pillow books or diaries. Upper class women sometimes kept diaries, and back in those days, paper was very expensive, so you wanted to keep it close by and under kind of lock and key. And people had pillows, but they generally were wooden pillows. And in those pillows, they had a little drawer, and that's where they would put their diaries. And so hence the pillow book of Sei Shonagon takes its name from that. People also were very much interested in Buddhism, which among the upper class was certainly very popular. There were really a couple of types of Buddhism which sort of paralleled the types of Buddhism as seen originally in India, where Buddhism had grown up and developed in the first place. The first type was Tendai Buddhism. And this is the type of Buddhism that we know in India as Mahayana. So if some of you have had my India course or have had some world history course or a religious studies course, you know that Mahayana literally means something like big ferry boat, big float. And it means that this is the big boat that carries most of us to nirvana. And the idea was that you did not have to become a monk in order to reach nirvana. And the last time we told you that this meant that there had been some very holy people who could have obtained nirvana if they wanted to, but chose to stay back and help all of the other people attain nirvana. And we called those very saintly people, these kind of Buddha saints, bodhisattvas. So this is all part of the Tendai sect. Just to kind of do some review. The Shingon Toshi sect on the other side was Hinayana, which literally means little ferry boat. It's sometimes called Theravada Buddhism, which basically said that in order to achieve nirvana, you had to go off to a monastery and renounce the world and become a monk. And of course, be male. Mount Hei was the main temple of Tendai Buddhism, and it was northeast of the city of Heian. And again, nirvana, when we try to describe nirvana, it's a very kind of amorphous thing to describe, at least in our Western philosophy. We used the last time the image that the Buddhists sometimes use of the flame and the candle when you blow the candle out. So if, we are the candle, we are the flame, and we die, what happens to the flame is it becomes smoke, which then dissipates into the air, which becomes one with the whole of the universe, one with the whole of nature, one with the Buddha. That is what nirvana is essential. It's kind of a state of wholeness with the one, or some other people might even say a state of nothingness. And then another type of Buddhism was Amida Buddhism. The idea here was that, it's even simpler, that there was the Amida Buddha, and here he is, depicted here, and that he ruled over a Western paradise, is where the dying could go. And that as you were dying, this Pure Land sect of the Amida Buddha believed that if you chanted the name Amida, Amida, Amida repeatedly, that when you died, you would go to a heavenly kind of place, a Buddha of the Western paradise, which would be sort of a place where you could stay, and then eventually you would attain nirvana. But it also changed over the course of the year to be kind of just a heaven where you'd stay anyhow. Shingon Buddhism then was this idea that you would become a monk, and if you're going to become a monk, Buddhist monk, then you're going to have more time to practice some of the things with Tantric Buddhism, which literally is a whole series of secret symbols and words in Tantric Buddhism that are passed on from a Buddhist teacher or master to his servants. And they might include things like recitation of mantras, literally reciting a whole string of syllables that may or may not have meaning. So, the syllables don't have to make up words necessarily, but the recitation of the mantras, as well as the use of mudra, or the way you put the hands and the fingers, are all going to be part of, and even something called mandala, which is, this representation of the universe that helps you focus on for meditation. All of these things are going to literally be ways to lead you into a meditative state. Of course, the common people would not be able really to go ahead and, join monasteries and be a part of that. Well, we really need to bring to an end, obviously, the Heian period. And so we're going to look at here an adult who became emperor by the name of Go-Sanjo, and he ruled from 1068 to 1072. And he didn't like the Fujiwara family very much. The Fujiwara family had been rather nasty to him. They had placed a curse upon him at one point in time, which he said made him sick. Someone even tried to shoot an arrow at him to kind of scare him. And although he only reigned for 4 years, it's Go-Sanjo that brought in another layer of the government called Insei, or cloister government, which literally was government by the retired emperor. So, as we said, many of the emperors, retired early. The average age was about 30. And he felt that those retired emperors could still have a say and an influence in the government. In fact, it's interesting to note that of the 33 emperors who ruled during the Heian period, 13 died in office, 1 was deposed, and 19 abdicated or retired. So Go-Sanjo was a vigorous ruler for those 4 years, trying to establish the power of the emperor, and he made certain that the region did not have that much power. He set up mechanisms where the imperial family could begin to exercise major powers itself. He set up an imperial household administrative office, which took care of imperial lands. He set up a Shoin records office, which literally made all of the Shoin, whether they were, Shoin owned by the temples, the shrines, or the Shoin families, to come and show their titles to their property, their charters to their property. It was sort of a Shoin audit. And if the charters were real, then he gave them a new charter, or redocumented the charter. And if he found things that didn't seem proper, then he would seize the land for the imperial family himself. So essentially what he was doing is he was doing 3 things. Number 1, he was reasserting imperial authority. Number 2, he was partly doing that by rechartering the Shoen. And 3, he was building up the imperial property by actually confiscating some of the Shoen and making them the imperial land himself, the imperial land of his family. In 1072, he retired from office and he put a 19-year-old emperor on the throne, but he continued to administer affairs in states as a retired emperor, that is, Insei, cloister government, as a retired emperor. During this period, obviously, because of these changes, the Fujiwara family was greatly diminished in power, and the regents had less power than ever before, and now you introduced a retired emperor. In the provinces, however, we know one thing was happening, and we've spoken of this. The conscript army of the imperial government was beginning to break down. And as the Shoen were developing more and more, sons of provincial government officials would go for military training and archery and horsemanship and other things. And these were the seeds of a new military class called the samurai. Okay, as we bring the Heian period to a close, then we see this warrior or samurai class beginning to arise. We see the importance of the Shoen, and we also see the importance of two very important families that are becoming influential at this time period. The first is the Minamoto family, and the second is the Taira family. The Minamoto family was a land-based power that was important in the area of the Kanto Plain, which we know is, that whole area that's very fertile around Tokyo, etc. Whereas the Taira family were more of a sea-based power around the inland sea. Other families, though, however, were becoming powerful and establishing their own army. And even the Buddhist temples themselves and the Shinto shrines needed warriors to protect themselves. And so the Buddhist temples would recruit warrior monks called the Sohei. Well, everything now is going to begin with all of these warrior families to dissolve, and the civil war is going to arise. One of the first and most important incidents that occurs is 1156, the Hogen incident, which is actually a succession dispute for the emperor, and it's got the Taira and Minamoto families fighting one another. The Taira family won, and the leader of that family was Taira no Kiyomori. And 3 years later, in 1159, the Taira family fought the Minamoto again, and the Taira won, and almost all of the Minamoto leaders were killed, with the exception of 6 Minamoto children. Taira no Kiyomori became the chief military leader, and at that time he moved to Kyoto and gained the right of marrying his daughter to an emperor. Meanwhile, we've got these 6 Minamoto children that were spared, that were sent into exile to live in the outlying provinces with the Taira family. The oldest of those, the oldest son, was called Minamoto no Yoritomo. And Minamoto no Yoritomo never forgot the fact that he was of the Minamoto family and that he felt it his duty to rebuild the Minamoto family and its power base. And he even did this with the blessing and support of his foster father, who was of the Taira family. And he builds his power base around the city of Kamakura. By 1180 through 1185, Japan is in civil war, is experiencing civil war. People began to plot against the power of Taira no Kiyomori. An imperial prince called for the restoration of the status quo, and Minamoto no Yoritomo and his younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, waged war against the Taira family. They used this whole succession crisis thing as a pretext to march on Kyoto. Fighting occurred between the two families in Kyoto, in the central provinces. The Taira were driven out of Kyoto back to their home base near the inland sea. And even at the inland sea, the younger brother Minamoto no Yoshitsune actually defeated the Taira family at a naval battle called Dan no Ura in 1185. So now things have shifted from the Taira family now to the Minamoto family, and particular to the oldest son, Minamoto no Yoritomo, who puts a new imperial prince on the throne as emperor, but he shifts the focus of power to his military government at Kamakura. And this is 1185. 7 years later, in 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo gets the emperor to give him the title of Seitai Shogun, literally meaning barbarian subduing great general. It was shortened to Shogun. And the government, so Minamoto is now the Shogun. He's holding the real power in Japan as a military ruler of a military government, a tent headquarters government, Bakufu government, or a shogunate. So what has clearly emerged by 1185 is feudalism in Japan. It's a military government. It's the military and political equivalent of what was happening in terms of economically the Shoen. So there's the shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo. He is operating a feudal government called the shogunate or the Bakufu. And it is in the Kanto plain at a place called Kamakura. Kamakura. The emperor, meanwhile, remained in Kyoto. So you have the emperor with his court at Kyoto, and you have Minamoto no Yoritomo as shogun with his headquarters at Kamakura. This is feudalism at work. This is Yoritomo as the head of the feudal structure, as the shogun, giving lands to his loyal vassals, giving them lands and offices. He's got offices like Jito, steward, and Shugo, protector or constable. He's got these officials out there in the provinces, and they're following local custom and military laws. They're collecting dues and taxes for the shogun, and they get to keep a portion of those taxes for themselves. So literally, he is a shogun eroding the revenue of the noble families, the court families, the central government, and putting it all under him. So he seems to be on top of the world. So why is he so darn suspicious? Yoritomo was suspicious of others. He was especially jealous of his younger half-brother, Yotsusune, who had, remember, at the naval battle, who had helped him win against the Taira family. But he becomes jealous of his younger half-brother, and he orders that his younger brother, Yotsusune, be assassinated. Yotsusune is surrounded by Yoritomo's forces, and he does what is considered the honorable thing. He kills his wife and infant children, and then he kills himself. And so Yotsusune becomes immortalized in Japanese literature as the tragic, the sad hero. Meanwhile, Yoritomo falls from his horse. It's not in battle, by the way. He's just out riding his horse. And he dies in 1199. And Yoritomo's two sons rule nominally for a while, and then their own family murders them. In fact, the two sons of Yoritomo are murdered largely by their mother, by Yoritomo's widow. Her name was Hojo Masako, and she was from the Hojo family. And guess what she does? She complicates matters even further by establishing a regency for the shoguns, a shogunal regency. So there's double regencies going on. Talk about the bifurcation of Japanese power. Hey, the focus of authority is still on the emperor, but the emperor has a regent ruling for him. The focus of power is really on the shogun, but by now, under Hojo Masako, there's a shogunal regency. Well, I got to bring this thing to an end, right? And part of this Kamakura period is going to be brought to the end by the Mongols, who are coming out of Mongolia, who have swept over China and taken over China and formed the Mongol Yuan dynasty there. They don't want to stop there. They're moving on all throughout Asia. They're moving into Korea. And in 1274 and 1281, two times, they attacked Japan. And both times, they meet typhoons, which is the Pacific name for hurricanes, right? So they meet up with typhoons, which force them to retreat. And the Japanese are so grateful that they call those typhoons that blew the Mongols away kamikaze, literally spirit winds. We'll hear kamikaze again during World War II when it's applied to those Japanese pilots who will land their planes into American ships and the like and take on the name kamikaze pilot spirit wind. Now, these invasions of the Mongols were huge. They were some of the largest invasions the world had ever seen. In 1274, Kublai Khan, who was Genghis Khan's grandson, sent 900 ships with 40,000 men to Japan. Typhoon happened, they retreated to Korea. In 1281, he sent not 900 ships, but 4,400 ships. Not 40,000 men, but 140,000 men to Japan. They too were swept away and retreated in a typhoon. The Mongols weren't going to end. They were planning more attacks, but hey, by this time their own empire had their own problems. Nonetheless, the Hojo Regency in Japan had to spend a heck of a lot of money to prepare for any further attacks, and the finances were literally depleted of the shogun himself. Sometimes when people have such horrible things happening around them, they look for solace to religion. And certainly during the Kamakura period, three types of Buddhism became even more popular, especially among the common people. They included Jodo, Pure Land Buddhism, which we talked about before, which was, the chanting of Amida Buddha at the time of your death. Jodo Shin, True Pure Land, and Lotus Sutra, and you can read more about those if you care to in your textbook. Also Zen Buddhism, which was popularized by Issai, who was a Buddhist priest who traveled twice to China. Zen Buddhism appealed to the warriors, the samurai. In Zen monasteries, gardens introduced the whole kind of dry landscape. So if you've ever seen a Zen garden, it's really kind of gravel and sand and moss and stones that you rake. Again, this idea of simplicity, not only in gardening, this simplicity, wabi as the Japanese call it, would also be reflected in the tea ceremony, which was popularized by Zen monks at the time. In 1318, the Emperor Go-Daigo began to rule. He wanted to reestablish imperial rule. He couldn't do it himself. Even though he became militarily powerful, he needed the help of others, and he looked towards Ashikaga Takauji of the Ashikaga family, which was a branch of the Minamoto family. Together, Ashikaga Takauji and his forces joined with Go-Daigo, and they were victorious, and in 1333 ended the Kamakura shogunate. Now, interesting enough, the two of them were allies. But Takauji had this idea that, if they are triumphant, that Go-Daigo would make him, Takauji Ashikaga, shogun. But Go-Daigo wanted the imperial rule to be reestablished. He didn't want to see the shogunate be reestablished. So the two became enemies. And it was inevitable that Takauji invaded Kyoto and forced the emperor into exile. Takauji set up his own emperor and had himself, Ashikaga Takauji, declared shogun. He set up his shogun government in Kyoto, which is, the name of the old Heian. And for a while there were two emperors. The Muromachi period, which this is all a part of, takes its name from the district of Kyoto called Muromachi, which was the seat of the shogun's government during this period. For most part, weak shoguns ruled during this period, with the exception of Yoshimitsu, who created the position of retired shogun in 1395. So, oh boy, we've got regents for emperors, regents for emperors, shoguns, regents for shoguns, retired emperors. Now we've got a new retired shogun. All very complicated things, all underscoring the fact, and if you can't remember it all, that's fine, I don't either, that the focus of authority is always with the emperor, but the focus of power, the real power, is always someplace else. Yoshimitsu created the position of retired shogun in 1395 and then built the Kinkakuji, or Golden Pavilion, shown here in Kyoto, for his own retirement. Well, these provincial feudal lords that owned a lot of the property out in the provinces, they're called daimyo. They're the feudal lords, right? They're out in the provinces. And they become more and more important during this period of feudal Japan. Civil war is going to prevail freely from about 1467 to about 1600, so almost 135, 40 years. And this civil war is really going to devastate much of Japan. It starts out with the Onin Civil War of 1467 to 77 that destroyed much of the city of Kyoto. Then the Civil War moved out into the outer provinces and became known more as Sengoku, the Warring States period. Now there's vast disagreement among historians as to, the dates used for this Warring States period. Some say it started as early as 1467 with the Onin Civil War, and it lasted as long as 1600 with the Battle of Sekigahara. So just know that it's not precise, the dating, but there is 135, 40 years of civil war that devastates Japan. There are some really cool things happening. No drama is becoming more and more popular. This is the drama that uses these masks. You can read a little bit about it here. It's also during this period the Portuguese first arrive in Japan in 1543. They'll bring firearms with them, but they'll also bring Christianity through St. Francis Xavier, who comes to Japan. One of the most important of the daimyo, of these feudal lords, was Oda Nobunaga. And in 1568, he took Kyoto and became the real power behind the Ashikaga shogun. So it is to him that we now need to turn, as well as to two other people who are going to be equally important during this Warring States period in developing what is finally the Tokugawa shogunate. Japanese schoolboys and schoolgirls learn about these three leaders, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. And one of the stories sometimes told about them, of course, is a legendary story of a canary that would not sing. And the canary does not want to sing, and so Oda Nobunaga basically says that he's going to get the canary to sing simply by forcing it to sing. Canary, little canary, you are going to sing or I am going to kill you. That represents his kind of philosophy, his personality. Toyotomi Hideyoshi says, little canary, I am going to persuade you to sing. That is his personality. And Tokugawa Ieyasu says, little canary, I will wait for you to sing. It's interesting because the story, obviously, you're going to see where Tokugawa Ieyasu becomes the victor, and he becomes the victor through great patience. Oda Nobunaga was a powerful daimyo who had defeated other daimyo, and in 1568, Oda Nobunaga successfully seized Kyoto in support of one of the claimants to the position of shogun. For all intents and purposes, Oda became the power behind the throne, and the Ashikaga shogunate essentially ended, although an Ashikaga family member held the title of shogun for another 20 years until 1588. What we know about Oda Nobunaga is he was a cruel and violent man. He had members of his own family killed, and at one time he had 20,000 of his enemies burned alive. He especially hated the Buddhists, whom he saw as a threat. He rewarded his vassals with land. His forces used firearms introduced by the Portuguese, and by the time of his death, he had brought half of Japan under his control. And then, ironically, he died in a fire inside a burning temple. That's ironic since he had burned so many people and since he hated the Buddhists. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had risen from being a foot soldier under Oda Nobunaga all the way up to the rank of general. And when Oda Nobunaga died, he assumed power and built a great castle at Osaka. He redistributed fiefs to his loyal vassals, that is, to the daimyo. He confiscated weapons of the peasants. He reunified most of the country. And in 1597, he crucified 26 Christians. So 9 of those were Europeans. These are considered the 26 martyrs of Japan, first 26. He became more and more suspicious with age, and he ended up executing his nephew's family. He had adopted, by the way, his nephew before he had an actual male son, Hideyori, so perhaps that had something to do with it. Messengers who brought him bad news sometimes received death. For instance, he might have him sawed in half. He wanted to invade China, and in the attempt, Toyotomi invaded Korea twice, in 1592 and 1597, but was forced back. He wasn't exactly getting along with Tokugawa Ieyasu, but Tokugawa Ieyasu did accept Toyotomi as the leader, as his overlord. But Toyotomi never really trusted Tokugawa Ieyasu and decided to relocate him farther away, 350 miles away from him, in the, ironically, very fertile region of Kanto, the Kanto Plain, which was the area of Edo, which today we know as Tokyo. Well, in 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi lay on his deathbed, surrounded by the 5 great elders of Japan, one of whom was Tokugawa Ieyasu. And he asked that the elders care for his infant son, Toyotomi Hideyori. And Tokugawa Ieyasu believed that that would be the case, and he agreed to do so. Tokugawa Ieyasu found himself fighting against rebelling daimyo who didn't, accept the fact that the wishes of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And Tokugawa Ieyasu won a very decisive battle of Sekigahara in 1600. 3 years later, Tokugawa Ieyasu took the title of shogun, and thus began the Tokugawa Bakufu, otherwise known as the Tokugawa Shogunate. Tokugawa Ieyasu would be shogun from 1603 to 1616. He would have under his control 275 or so daimyo. He would regulate them very closely, requiring what was called the alternate attendance system. So each daimyo, each lord, had to spend 1 year in Tokyo, in Edo, Tokyo, the headquarters of the Tokugawa Shogunate. It was called Edo then. And then the next year he would have to spend, the daimyo would have to spend in his domain out in the province. Meanwhile, the daimyo's family, all the daimyo's families had to live full-time in Edo, Tokyo. This assured that, if they went back to their provinces and started to get some rebellious ideas in mind, that in essence the shogun could, take it out against their families. Their families living in Tokyo were kind of an insurance policy that the daimyo would actually behave themselves. It was also very expensive for the daimyo to keep up appearances, to have a place both in Edo and a place back in their domains. And when they went back and forth between the two, they had to have all of their retainers and samurai and so forth go back and forth with them. All very expensive stuff. Society, of course, in such a feudal structure, had little mobility. It was really divided into what the Japanese called Shino-kosho, warrior, peasant, artisan, merchant. At the top of all of this were the warriors, the samurai. Then, surprisingly, came the peasants, who produced the food. And then came the artisans, who produced the stuff, whether it be porcelain or, sandals, clothes or whatever. And then the merchants who sold things, which with the Confucian system, merchants were always at the bottom. At least they may not have been economically at the bottom, but socially, culturally, they were not regarded very highly. And of course, at the very, very bottom were a couple of outcast classes, which included the burakumin. The burakumin were the people who performed the dirtiest things, picking up garbage, burying people, and things that were considered impure religiously by Shinto, by Buddhism especially. Butchering animals, working in leather work, of butchered animals, things of that sort. Well, now you remember that when Toyotomi Hideyoshi died, he made Tokugawa Ieyasu and the others promise to take care of his infant son, Toyotomi Hideyori. And by this time, Toyotomi Hideyori had become a young man. Not everybody liked Tokugawa Ieyasu, and so a lot of the people who opposed Tokugawa Ieyasu kind of surrounded themselves around Toyotomi Hideyori. So Hideyori quickly becomes accused of subversion. And that is in 1614. And Tokugawa even attacks Hideyori at his castle at Osaka and tricks Hideyori, saying, he's going to make peace with him, and then he doesn't. Tokugawa Ieyasu fills in the moat surrounding the castle. He attacks. Tokugawa wins, and 100,000 people died. And among them were Hideyori, who committed seppuku, ritual suicide. So Tokugawa Ieyasu is gaining control completely of Japan. And in 1638, in the Shimabara Massacre, which is considered the last major revolt of Japanese history, 35,000 people died, many of them Christians. And the shogun was victorious. A year later, having had enough of the Christians and the Europeans, the shogun in 1639 expelled all foreigners, except for some Dutch people, not many, living on the island of Deshima in the port city of Nagasaki. So they lived on this little island of Deshima in the port city of Nagasaki. And a little bit of trade, a few ships a year were allowed with the Dutch. They also traded a little bit with the Chinese. But other than that, Tokugawa shogun decided, Tokugawa Ieyasu, to close Japan off to the rest of the world. Now this is an amazing thing. In all of world history, I don't know of any society, country that was able to achieve what Japan achieved and literally shut itself off to the rest of the world, isolate itself for about 250 years. And of course it could do it partly because it was in the midst of a feudal system of government, the Tokugawa shogunate, and partly because it was an island nation. It's much easier to shut off a land nation. But what they did were three things. Overseas Japanese were not allowed to return to Japan without permission. The Japanese themselves, number two, were not allowed to leave Japan to build even ships without the shogun's approval. And the shogun confiscated the guns and cannon of the daimyo. And so ensued a vast 250 years of isolation of the Tokugawa shogunate. And what grew up was a warrior culture, a samurai culture, Bushido, way of the warrior, loyalty and discipline, but also mixed with it the importance of learning, of the arts. Warriors not only knew how to use their swords, how to fight, but they also learned calligraphy, writing poems, chivalrous behavior, etc. And all of this plays into this loyalty of the Japanese society, Bushido, proper ways of behaving. Even this loyalty will go beyond death itself. So, some samurai served their lords, their daimyo, and what happens if the daimyo, the lord, misbehaved himself? He could be executed. He could be dismissed, demoted. And in that case, the samurai would have no master. They would be masterless. And we call those masterless samurai who had no master, ronin. Bushido, way of the warrior, loyalty, is all demonstrated in the famous story of the 47 ronin. And this is what happened. The lord, the daimyo, his name was Osamu Naganori. And he was visiting the shogun's castle along with his chief of protocol, Kira Yoshinaka. And Kira Yoshinaka insulted his master, Osamu Naganori, and Osamu drew his sword in the shogun's castle, and that was, and no, you were not supposed to draw your sword for obvious reasons in the shogun's castle. So he did the only thing that he could do. Osamu committed seppuku, which is ritual suicide by falling on your sword and cutting your belly open. His samurai now were ronin. They were masterless, but they vowed to avenge his death. Took a while. They were patient. 2 years later, they killed Kira, and then the 47 ronin themselves committed seppuku, ritual suicide. This is loyalty. This is the kind of thing that builds a society that's going to slowly march towards World War II. Another example of Bushido was the Book of Five Rings, written by Miyamoto Musashi. And this is a book, famous book, about the martial arts and military strategy. And one more thing I want to place within the context of all of this is, although Confucianism remained important in Japan, just as it was in China, it was changed, like many things, by the Japanese. Chinese Confucianism always allowed you to think about your conscience and have some loyalty to your conscience. In Japan, though, things were quickly moving Confucianism to a loyalty to one's superior. This is a vast and important difference. Well, not everything's military during this time period of the Tokugawa shogunate. In fact, the fifth shogun, who ruled from 1646 until 1680, did not like the military. His name was Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, and he was called the Dog Shogun. He loved animals. He wanted to pass laws and did pass laws to protect animals. He built dog pounds in the capital at Edo to take care of 40,000 dogs. His mother, interesting enough, was of the merchant class, so he was trained as a scholar. He condemned violence. He passed laws against the killing of infants, infanticide, and a cultural flowering ensued in Japan. By the 1700s, Shintoism was experiencing a revival, Shinto, as well as those old historical accounts, the Kojiki of Japan. People were learning about their nation's past, kokugaku, national learning. And when they were learning about it, they were learning that, Japan had but one time been ruled by an emperor and not by a shogun. The Japanese also became interested in Western science and medicine, astronomy, and the like, and the shogun allowed that as long as there was no mention of Christianity. By the late 1700s, Edo, that is modern-day Tokyo, had a population of about 1 million people. It was the largest city in the world. Osaka and Kyoto were also very large cities of about 500,000 people themselves. And the new wealthy merchants were arising. The merchants were becoming increasingly wealthy, and they liked all kinds of entertainment. They liked kabuki theater, for instance, which really translates itself as kind of, figuratively speaking, bizarre theater, but literally the art of singing and dancing. It's a dance drama. It's very elaborate, and it would become very ribald at times, so the shogun eventually even banned females from being actresses. So even the roles, only males could be actors in kabuki theater, and they had to play all of the parts, including the parts of women. Also popular was bunraku, which was puppet theater, and woodblock prints called ukiyo-e, which were pictures of the floating world. And the floating world became increasingly associated with sensuality. In fact, a whole district of Edo, the Yoshiwara district, became the pleasure district of Edo. This is the time period of geisha, both female and male geisha, who were like companions, and they were very refined, very educated. They sang, they wrote poetry. They would be companions to wealthy people. On the other hand, there were very highly paid prostitutes called courtesans, who they were so wealthy and so respected that they could turn down clients if they so desired. And of course, among the samurai and others, there was the practice of same-sex relations as well. I'm not using the term homosexuality because homosexuality was really a term that comes, was invented kind of in the late 19th century, but is true of many parts of the world at the time where sex was considered just sex, and there were varieties of form of sex. Same-sex relationships, especially among the samurai, were quite popular. The Japanese did not practice primogeniture. Primogeniture is where the eldest son inherits the father's estate. And because they did not practice primogeniture, all of these daimyo began having sons. And if a daimyo, say for instance, had 4 or 5 sons, he divided his property among the 4 or 5 sons, and they in turn would have sons. So the property would be divided even further. So what you can see is the daimyo, the landed lords, were becoming poorer and poorer over time, and some of them were actually becoming indebted to the wealthy merchants. And as the daimyo became poorer, the samurai became poorer too. Some of the samurai became quite impoverished and were even forced, and I mean this was a horrible thing, forced to sell their swords, which, was what they were all about. They were more than just swords. They were symbols of who they were. They were like the souls of the samurai. Literature flowered and flourished during this time period. Perhaps the most renowned poet of the Edo period was Matsuo Basho, and he really brought respectability to a form of poetry of verse known as haiku. So we're going to show you Basho's old pawn here. Haiku was a form of poetry of verse where it had 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. So, in this case, the Japanese is Furuikeya, which is 5 syllables, Kawazu Tobiko Mu, 7 syllables, Mizu no Oto, 5 syllables. When we translate it into English, it loses something. Not only does it lose the number of syllabi, syllables, excuse me. It becomes old pawn, a frog leaps in, water sound, etc. Another very popular author was Ihara Sakaku, son of a wealthy merchant. He became a noted poet and writer, wrote about merchants and samurai, prostitutes, just, all kinds of things. He wrote The Life of an Amorous Man, which had, and again, it's a bisexual main character. Homosexuality and heterosexuality were not considered incompatible at that time. Again, they didn't even have terms. They were much more accepted than in modern Japan, which has become much more puritanical about such matters. He also wrote something called The Life of an Amorous Woman. Well, once you know, Westerners, Europeans, Americans were becoming interested in China and Japan. They were becoming interested for trading, for refueling stations for their steamships. They were becoming interested in whale oil, which was not only used for lamps, but was used in the lubrication of the new steam machinery of the 19th century. And so in July of 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry, during the presidency of Millard Fillmore, sailed into Edo Harbor with 4 ships, which interestingly enough was 1/4 of the U.S. Navy at the time. The Japanese saw the black smoke billowing from these steamships and called the ships the Black Ships. Perry demanded that the Japanese open up trade to the Americans, stating that he would return the following spring for their answers. The shogun immediately began to ask the daimyo for advice, and a great debate ensued as to what to do. Some supported opening up the country and getting it out of its isolation, and some did not. Perry returned a little early in late winter rather than spring of 1854, and he brought with him twice the number of ships and crews this time in 1854. Negotiations took 23 days, and Japan opened up its doors to the Americans. The Americans gave them all kinds of gifts, like a 1/4 scale railroad, a functioning railroad, and they began to study that, and it would not be long until they were building their own railroads. The Japanese would then make other trade agreements with Britain in 1854, Russia in 1855, France and Holland, etc. But the doors had been cracked open, the isolation of Japan was ending, and some felt that the shogun did not effectively deal with this foreign threat. And we'll find out what happens to the Tokugawa shogunate as we see the Meiji Restoration in our next lecture. Any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a great week.